Nobody tells you it starts in your 30s. That's the first problem. Most women have a mental image of menopause as something that happens at 51, maybe 52, with a clear before and after. One chapter ends, another begins. What actually happens is a transition that can last anywhere from 4 to 12 years before the final period, and it starts quietly, with symptoms that have nothing obviously hormonal about them. Trouble sleeping, anxiety that appears from nowhere, cycles that shift slightly, a short fuse that wasn't there before, a metabolism that stops responding the way it used to. These don't announce themselves as perimenopause. They announce themselves as stress or aging or just life. And so most women spend years managing symptoms without ever knowing the system underneath is shifting. That changes today. We're covering the 8 most significant perimenopausal symptoms, what's actually happening hormonally in each one, why it presents the way it does, and what makes it distinct from other things it's commonly mistaken for. Not to alarm, to orient, because understanding the mechanism changes everything about how you navigate it. Hot flashes. Hot flashes are the symptom most associated with perimenopause, and also the one most misunderstood in terms of what's actually causing them. A hot flash isn't just a feeling of warmth. It's a sudden dysregulation of the body's thermostat, a mechanism controlled by a region of the brain called the hypothalamus. In a stable hormonal environment, the hypothalamus maintains a comfortable thermal window. When estrogen fluctuates, which is the defining feature of perimenopause, not a steady decline, but an erratic up and down before the eventual drop, the thermostat becomes hypersensitive. The zone of thermal comfort narrows. Triggers that the hypothalamus previously ignored, a slightly warm room, a sip of coffee, a moment of stress, now register as emergencies. The result is a sudden dilation of blood vessels near the skin, a flush of heat that typically starts in the chest and rises through the neck and face, sweating, and then a chill as the body overcorrects. Hot flashes during sleep, night sweats, follow the same mechanism but with an added layer. Core body temperature naturally drops during sleep. When that process is repeatedly interrupted by thermal dysregulation, sleep architecture fractures. You don't just wake up hot, you lose the deep and REM stages that the body needs to repair itself. Night after night, the sleep debt compounds, and with it, mood, cognition, immune function, and metabolic health degrade. Here's what most women are not told. Hot flashes can begin years before the menstrual cycle shows any visible change. The hormonal fluctuation that triggers them starts well before the outward signs most people associate with perimenopause. The thermostat is recalibrating. That process takes time, and it's happening whether anyone names it. Sleep disruption in perimenopause is both a symptom and an amplifier of every other symptom on this list. The hormonal drivers are multiple, and they compound each other. Progesterone, which converts to the calming neurosteroid allopregnenolone and supports sleep quality, declines in perimenopause. Estrogen, which helps regulate the sleep-wake cycle and support REM sleep, becomes erratic. Cortisol, which should be low at night, is more easily disrupted when estrogen is unstable. And melatonin production, which begins declining in the mid-40s, provides less reliable timing signal for the whole system. The result is a sleep profile that changes in characteristic ways. Difficulty falling asleep, waking between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. and being unable to return to sleep, lighter sleep overall, and vivid or disturbing dreams during the sleep that does occur. The 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. window is particularly common and has a physiological explanation. Cortisol begins its morning rise earlier than most people realize, around 2 or 3 a.m. in a healthy rhythm. When progesterone is low and cortisol sensitivity is elevated, that early rise weaks the brain before the body is ready. The result is the specific perimenopausal experience of lying awake in the early hours with a mind that won't slow down, often accompanied by anxiety or a sense of dread that has no clear object. Chronic sleep deprivation then accelerates hormonal disruption. It raises cortisol, it reduces insulin sensitivity, it suppresses growth hormone, it lowers leptin and raises ghrelin, shifting hunger and metabolism. Which means that poor sleep during perimenopause doesn't just feel bad, it actively worsens the hormonal environment that caused the poor sleep in the first place. Mood changes of perimenopause are among the most disorienting symptoms and the most likely to be misattributed. The hormonal mechanism runs through everything covered in the previous video. Estrogen's influence on serotonin and dopamine makes its fluctuation during perimenopause emotionally destabilizing in ways that track with, but don't always align with life circumstances. Progesterone's decline reduces the GABA calming effect that helps regulate anxiety. Cortisol becomes harder to regulate. DHEA continues its long decline. The whole neurological support structure that mood depends on becomes less stable. What makes perimenopausal mood changes specifically difficult to navigate is their variability. This is not a consistent low mood. It's a system in fluctuation, days of clarity and emotional steadiness, followed by days of irritability, anxiety, tearfulness, or a flatness that feels like depression but doesn't respond to the things that usually help. The unpredictability itself is distressing because it's hard to trust your own emotional responses when you don't know which version of the system you're going to wake up with. The symptom that most often prompts a woman to seek help is rage, not sadness, not anxiety, a disproportionate, fast-rising anger that feels foreign, a reaction she recognizes as out of proportion but cannot seem to intercept in time. This is not a personality change. It's a nervous system with a compromised buffer responding to the same triggers it always had, but with less capacity to absorb them. One specific pattern worth naming: if mood symptoms are consistently worse in the week before the period and improve after it starts, that's a perimenopausal pattern tied specifically to the progesterone drop. If they are continuous and don't track the cycle, the thyroid and adrenal picture deserve attention. Brain fog, cognitive changes during perimenopause, brain fog, word retrieval difficulty, memory lapses, difficulty concentrating are among the most frightening symptoms and the ones women are least likely to mention to a doctor. They're frightening because the first thought is often Alzheimer's or early cognitive decline. The distinction matters enormously. Perimenopausal brain fog is hormonal, fluctuating, and not progressive in the way neurodegenerative disease is. It moves with the hormonal environment. It's worst during low estrogen phases and often improves during hormonal stabilization. The mechanism is direct. Estrogen has significant neuroprotective effects. It supports glucose metabolism in the brain, which is how brain cells fuel themselves, and it influences the production of acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter central to memory and learning. When estrogen becomes erratic, brain energy metabolism becomes less efficient, and acetylcholine signaling weakens. The specific experiences women describe are consistent: walking into a room and having no idea why, losing words mid-sentence, particularly nouns and names, reading the same paragraph 3 times without retaining it, difficulty following complex conversations, a general sense that thinking requires more effort than it used to. These are real neurological changes. They are not imagined, not dramatic, and not permanent in the context of perimenopause, but they are real, and dismissing them or being dismissed when you raise them adds a layer of distress to a symptom that is already unsettling enough. Sleep deprivation, cortisol elevation, and thyroid fluctuation all compound cognitive symptoms, which means that addressing the sleep and stress picture is not just about energy, it directly affects how clearly the brain functions. Changes in menstrual cycle changes in perimenopause are usually the first symptom that gets medically acknowledged as perimenopausal because they're visible and measurable in a way that mood and sleep changes aren't. The hormonal story behind cycle changes in perimenopause is specific. As the ovarian reserve declines, follicles become less responsive to the hormonal signals that trigger ovulation. When ovulation is irregular or absent, progesterone is not produced in adequate amounts for that cycle, because progesterone in the second half of the cycle is made by the corpus luteum, the structure that forms after ovulation. No ovulation, no corpus luteum, no progesterone. This leads to cycles that can be heavier, longer, more irregular, and more symptomatic, because estrogen continues to build the uterine lining without progesterone reliably signaling it to stop and shed in an organized way. The specific patterns of perimenopausal cycle change vary. Cycles might shorten first, dropping from 28 days to 24 or 25. Then they might lengthen unpredictably. Periods might become heavier for a period of years before eventually lightening and spacing out. Cycles might be skipped entirely and then return. Spotting between periods can occur. What's important to understand is that heavy bleeding during perimenopause, while common, should not be normalized without investigation. Fibroids, polyps, and endometrial changes can cause or contribute to heavy bleeding and deserve evaluation. Perimenopause does not make every gynecological symptom hormonal. It makes the baseline more complex. Weight changes in perimenopause, specifically the redistribution of body fat toward the abdomen, are one of the most consistent and least controllable symptoms, and they operate through multiple simultaneous mechanisms. Estrogen influences where fat is stored. In the reproductive years, estrogen promotes fat storage in the hips and thighs, the classic pear shape. As estrogen declines and becomes erratic, this signaling shifts and fat preferentially deposits in the abdomen, the apple distribution, that is metabolically more active and more strongly associated with cardiovascular and metabolic risk. At the same time, insulin sensitivity declines with age and is further reduced by elevated cortisol and disrupted sleep, which are both common in perimenopause. Lower insulin sensitivity means blood sugar regulation becomes less efficient, fat storage increases, and fat loss in response to caloric deficit becomes harder. Muscle mass also declines with age, and this process accelerates during perimenopause, partly because testosterone, which supports muscle synthesis, is declining, and partly because sleep disruption reduces growth hormone, which also supports muscle maintenance. Less muscle means lower resting metabolic rate. The body burns fewer calories at rest, even if activity levels haven't changed. This is why women in perimenopause frequently report that nothing about their habits has changed, but their body composition has. They're not wrong. The metabolic environment has shifted under the same inputs. The weight changes of perimenopause respond poorly to calorie restriction alone, and often worsen with aggressive restriction because that raises cortisol further. Resistance training, protein adequacy, sleep quality, and blood sugar stability are the levers that actually move the needle, not eating less. Joint pain and physical discomfort during perimenopause are among the least discussed symptoms and the most surprising to women experiencing them. Estrogen has significant anti-inflammatory effects. Estrogen receptors exist throughout joint tissue, in cartilage, in the synovial membrane that lines joints, in tendons and ligaments. When estrogen drops or becomes erratic, these tissues lose some of their anti-inflammatory protection.
The result is joint stiffness, aching, and sometimes swelling that has no injury or arthritis diagnosis to explain it. Morning stiffness is particularly characteristic. The joints that were fine yesterday are stiff and uncomfortable on waking and take time to loosen up. Women often interpret this as arthritis or aging, or a sign that something is structurally wrong. The reality is that this pattern, diffuse, bilateral, worse in the morning, and improved with movement, is consistent with the inflammatory picture of declining estrogen, not structural joint disease. Muscles also become more prone to tension and slower to recover. Headaches, including migraines, can worsen or first appear during perimenopause because estrogen fluctuation is a well-documented migraine trigger, and the erratic hormonal swings of the transition period create exactly the conditions for estrogen withdrawal headaches. The joint and body symptom picture of perimenopause is one of the clearest examples of a symptom that gets treated as orthopedic when it's endocrine. The joint hasn't changed. The hormonal environment around it has. Changes in sexual function during perimenopause are among the most common and the least likely to be raised voluntarily because they exist in the overlap between a medical symptom and a deeply personal experience. The physical changes are specific and have identifiable causes. Estrogen maintains the thickness, elasticity, and lubrication of vaginal tissue. As estrogen declines, vaginal tissue becomes thinner, drier, and less elastic, a condition called genitourinary syndrome of menopause, which can begin in perimenopause well before the final period. Penetrative sex can become uncomfortable or painful. This is not psychological. It is tissue-level change driven by estrogen withdrawal. Testosterone, which in women supports libido, genital sensitivity, and the capacity for arousal, also declines steadily through the perimenopause transition. Many women notice not just a reduction in desire, but a qualitative change. Arousal takes longer, feels less automatic, feels less connected to external triggers that previously worked reliably. Sleep deprivation and elevated cortisol suppress libido through separate pathways. A nervous system running on high cortisol is not oriented toward desire. It is oriented toward threat management. These two states are physiologically incompatible. What matters most here is that changes in sexual function during perimenopause are almost always multifactorial. Tissue change, hormonal shift, sleep impact, stress, and the relational and psychological layers that sit on top of all of it. The physical drivers are real, addressable, and do not require acceptance as an inevitable part of aging. They require honest conversation, with a doctor and often with a partner, that the hormonal picture makes possible once you have the language for it.